Well, welcome everybody. It's hard to believe this is our going to be our last Islington Reads before our summer break, but have no fear. We do have a date set for our September Islington Reads, and I'll tell you all about that near the end of the meeting. But today, for everyone who is joining us for the first time, Islington Reads is a community book club. It's a partnership between Islington United Church and a novel spot bookshop, and it's open to all ages, genders, and identities. And it's been great. We've had such a wide variety of people zooming in from all around the world. It's been a lot, and a lot of people in the local community. So it's been a lot of fun. Today we have the pleasure of having Shelly Sanders with us, and I want to thank Shelley for joining us tonight, and also for HarperCollins and Shelley's publicist Cindy Ma for helping coordinate getting Shelley here tonight. So thank you, HarperCollins, and to Cindy. But most of all, thank you, Shelley. We've got an exciting evening. I just think this book is absolutely brilliant. I did not know anything about Latvia's role and what happened in Latvia in World War II. So I found it absolutely a fascinating read, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more on this book from you today, Shelley. But before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of Shelley. So Shelley was born in Toronto. She moved to Illinois at a young age, so sort of just outside of Chicago, suburban Chicago. After a number of years there, she and her family moved to Waterloo, and I guess they stayed there for a while because Shelley got her degree, English degree, honors English, from the University of Waterloo. And then from there, Shelley went on to get her master's of journalism, and I guess it's no longer called Ryerson University, but it's called Metropolitan Toronto University. And once she got that, she ended up becoming a reporter, and she worked in Peterborough for a while. And after a fair stint, Shelley got married and started a family. And guess she decided that she wanted to try doing some freelance writing. And by all accounts, she was very successful because she's written for the Toronto Star, Maclean's, National Post, Canadian Living, I think Parent Magazine as well. She also took a creative writing course from the University of Toronto, and then has started into the novel writing. So she's done a trilogy based on, I think, so it's for YA readers. I've not read it yet, but there's Rachel's Secret, Rachel's Promise, and Rachel's Hope. And I guess that was based again on Shelley's family story about some leaving Russia and going to Shanghai. So a very interesting period in history that's covered off in that trilogy. And then she started writing Daughters of the Occupation, which is what we're going to be hearing Shelley talk about today. So it's absolutely fabulous to have you here. And I think that covers off the introduction. Shelley does live in Oakville, so not far from Etobicoke, and it's wonderful to have local authors from the GTA coming to Islington Reads. So without further ado, I will pass the spotlight over to Shelley, and she's going to speak for 15-20 minutes about Daughters of the Occupation, about her reading, how she decided she wanted to write this story, anything that Shelley wants to talk about, really. We're a very easygoing group of individuals here. And then once you're sort of finished with what you want to tell us, we've got a whole bunch of questions to ask you, and we'll go for a Q&A. We have disabled the chat so everyone can concentrate on what Shelley has to say and the questions that will come afterwards. If there is time prior to, getting to before 8 o'clock, we will open up the chat for people to ask questions. But like I said, we have a fair number to get through, so we may or may not get to questions in the chat. Anyway, without further ado, welcome Shelley to Islington Reads.
Thank you so much. I am really happy to be here, and I love the numbers. I love seeing people reading, and I also was in the store signing books and love the store, and will definitely be coming back as one of my husband's offices is in Etobicoke, so I'll hitch a ride and get some books from there because I like to support independent bookstores. So thank you for your wonderful bookstore. So so Daughters of the Occupation really was a labor of love and took years really of of kind of coming together, because it really started a long time ago, germinating in my head when I noticed things, within my family. So, for example, as a child, we actually, in the Toronto neighborhood we lived in, was a Jewish neighborhood, and our neighbors were Jewish. And my mother tells me that as a very young girl, I would invite myself to their house for all the high holidays and Shabbat dinners and things, and that I just loved all of that. I should point out I was raised in a non-religious family and had no idea that I had Jewish blood, DNA, whatever. I didn't know any of this. And so anyway, and so that was something that was just sort of there. There was always this sort of interest in Judaism, in Jewish writing as I got older, in literature, the history. I watched the Holocaust miniseries. I don't know if you remember it, in the 1970s. That was the first thing that came out. Meryl Streep was in it, and I was in Chicago, and I watched that, and I was absolutely horrified. That was my first sort of introduction to the Holocaust, as well as the Diary of Anne Frank, of course. And so those sort of things just really kind of sat with me. Again, I did not know. And then, so I also was really fascinated in Russia, anything Russian, and have read a lot of Russian literature without even knowing my grandmother's. This was before I even knew my grandmother's past, and knew anything, because my grandmother would not talk about her past at all. She came to Canada and arrived right before the war, and was in Montreal with my grandfather, and there were signs in Montreal that said no blacks, no dogs, no Jews everywhere. Jews weren't allowed to join certain clubs like golf clubs and things like that. They weren't allowed to practice in the hospital, so that's why they have the Montreal Jewish Hospital. There was a lot of restrictions, and I think my grandmother, um, having lived through pogroms in Russia, she and being pregnant with my mother, probably was fed up, tired, and wanted to distance herself from that religion, especially when she saw Canada turn away the boat of refugees from Europe. They were Jewish refugees to the St. Louis. And so that was right about the time she was pregnant with my mother. And I mean, she must have absolutely been horrified. Again, I don't know, because I never got the chance to ask her, but I can only speculate. It must have been horrifying to her to see that treatment. So she hid her Judaism, and so never talked about it. I never got a chance to talk about it. She never spoke about it. My mother only found out when she was 24, that she was Jewish. And so it was a really well kept secret. So I had, as I got older, I got a lot more curious. But again, my grandmother died when I was 13, so I didn't get a chance to ask her these questions. So, but one thing I noticed as I looked at photos and I got older, I noticed a lot of similarities in the expression of my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother. There was this kind of sadness in their eyes, and this just sort of look. And I already knew, I didn't call it depression, because when I was growing up, I didn't know that hadn't been talked about. But I would see my mother in the garage sitting and weeping, and I would find her there and just shut the garage door, and just didn't know what it was, but knew that that was not a good thing. And I found out later that my grandmother had stayed in her bathrobe all day playing, what did she play, solitaire at the kitchen table. And when my mom got home from school, she was still in her bathrobe playing solitaire. So, but my mom said, well, no, she didn't have depression. But yeah, no, she really did. It was something that really kind of fell into the maternal side of things. And I was diagnosed with depression, like, 20 years ago. And it's both my daughters have anxiety issues and a bit of depression as well. And so it really seems to come on that maternal side. And this is something that really, I think, ignited the intergenerational trauma aspect of the book. Because when I started reading these accounts, in my research, they did a lot of research with Holocaust survivors, and they found that 3 generations later, or 2 generations, I should say, that people that had absolutely no experience, that were living in North America, had had attributes of post-traumatic stress disorder. They had things like depression, which I'm talking about. They had things, they had an unnatural fear of fire, for example, because their grandparent may have been seen, people gassed. They had, different sort of fears and things that were completely unexplained, but could be related back to their grandparent who had experienced the Holocaust. So this really fascinated me, and I started to think, like, my grandmother wasn't in the Holocaust, but she experienced pogroms as well. The Cossacks, she lived in Siberia under the last Tsar, and the Cossacks were known to enter into Jewish houses and rape women and children. So I don't know, I don't know, but there's definitely some trauma there, on the maternal side. Again, don't know. And so these were the sort of things that struck me. And another thing that I saw amongst some of the women was this meanness, this kind of attitude. Um, Miriam, for example, is inspired by my Aunt Nusha, who lived a lot longer than my grandmother, and I was able to speak to her and get some information about my grandmother's past and living in Siberia and all of that. And Nusha, like Miriam, she cut off her son in a different, it was different than Miriam in the book, but she cut off her son, my mom's first cousin, because he didn't live a Jewish life. He married someone who was actually half Jewish, but they chose not to live Jewishly. So my cousin Chris, who's my age, never knew his grandmother, never knew his grandparents. I knew them because my mom kept a relationship up with her. So the irony is, I knew my grandmother's sister very well, and she was part of my life until she died. My cousin, who was the grandson, never knew her. And so that is not the only case of this estrangement. Like this sort of meanness, it's just sort of comes down the line. My great grandmother Sophie, her brother, they had the granddaughter of the the daughter of my great grandmother's brother. It's kind of confusing, but she cut off her son when he married a Catholic. And I met my cousin, who's the result of that marriage, in New York when I was there when my book launched. And this is what really was kind of a goosebump moment. So she'd never known a grandmother her whole life, and she's about 40. And about 3 years ago, right before her grandmother died in her 90s, she knocked on her door, just like my character Sarah does, and said, "I'm your granddaughter." And I had no idea any of this happened. I'd written, Daughter's Occupation. I had a draft pretty much done by this point. I hadn't even met Monica, my cousin, didn't know any of this had happened. But it was one of those goosebump moments of life imitating art, because literally my character Sarah does that and, gets to know her grandmother. And there was my own cousin who knocked on her grandmother's door, and, this grandmother who had, cut off her son. And just there was just this meanness. So that just was very pervasive, and still is in my family. And these sort of things I think are trauma related, and I think there is really something to that, and because it's really affected my family. um, so um, so that was sort of a thing that developed. And then looking at the photos, as I say in the author's notes, which is in the back of the book, the photos, and finding out Latvia and all of that really stirred me. And when I started to read about it, like Sarah in the book, I was absolutely I was appalled. I couldn't believe that it had not been written about, especially when you consider that the number killed in the Rambula forest was actually almost the same as Babi Yar in Ukraine, and yet no one knew anything about it. And so that I just thought, I have to write about this, And the more I learned, the more I became really determined that I was going to write this. And then I visited Latvia, and I actually went twice, doing both research for the book and research on my family. And when I was there, it was it was kind of surreal, because when I went to the Jewish Museum, the woman behind the desk reminded me so much of my grandmother. It was uncanny. And I met so many people that reminded me of family. It was very, very bizarre and fascinating, and it was just a flood of emotions. So that was something that really struck me there. And the other thing that was really, really kind of amazing was I got to stand outside my great grandfather's house, which is still standing, and Yosel Talon's house, which is still standing. Both of them would have been taken. So Yosel's, no, my great grandfather Max, who was exiled to Siberia, that would have been taken by the Soviets or the Russians when he was exiled in 1905. And then Yosel's would have been taken by the Nazis. And so beautiful homes, and they were quite well off merchants, but it was really very amazing to stand there and know that my grandmother had probably graced that doorstep many times on her visits, because even though she lived in Siberia, you were allowed to travel back to Latvia to visit relatives because they were political exiles. They weren't criminal exiles. So I have photos of her in Latvia for family reunion. So I know she came back several times. And just the thought that she was there as a child just gave me goosebumps. I mean, it was really quite remarkable. So, I just felt a connection, and that was really important to me, as I'm named after her as well. So that kind of, and she's the only grandparent I knew. There was just a really deep connection there. Um, so, um, um, so that was sort of one of those kind of moments. And the other moment I think I allude to in the author's note was when I found out that my great grandparents were exiled in 1905, and that exile is how I'm here. Whereas everybody else in their whole family, people that I have photos of my grandmother with, many, many photos, um, they all died. They were all killed in the Holocaust. And my grandmother went to her grave not knowing what happened to them, which is just really, really sad that she never knew, because the Soviets came in and liberated Latvia and the Baltics in 1945. And they had Latvia until 1991 under Soviet control. So there was nothing talked about what had happened. And even when I went there 3 years ago, and I was asking one of my tour guides, she said, we still don't, it's not really good to talk about it here. We don't like to talk about it. People don't want to talk about the Holocaust or anything. And so that was very, very bizarre to me, because coming from North America, where we speak about it, and it was kind of one of those moments where you get a little sense of the Soviet kind of oppression. And that was very daunting, that they still don't talk about it, and still some people still refer to them as Soviets in those graves, not Jews, because that was the Soviet mantra, especially under Stalin, that they were Soviet citizens killed. The Jews were not being targeted, but they were Soviets. And so that was why there were no memorials or anything made, and it wasn't until after they were liberated from the Soviets in 91. So that's one of the reasons it wasn't talked about. But Babi Yar was also under Soviet control. So it's still a mystery to me why Rambula has just sort of fallen under. I'm hoping that this book will open up the doors. And that another thing that's kind of disconcerting, which I found out from the director of the museum when I was there, was that there is still a parade, and it took place this year, that honors veterans of the SS division in the war, during the war, Latvian SS veterans. And so they literally parade down the street. There were hundreds out there this year, and they have it in March, and they cheer them on and everything. Of course, Jewish groups around the world think this is horrible and have spoken against this, but they have it. The only years they haven't had it since I think it was like the 1970s were during COVID. But they have this parade that honors and reveres the members of the SS Latvian division. So that gives you a sense of how the people there are still under the Soviet kind of control mind-wise, and still some of them don't believe that they are Jews, or don't believe the Holocaust actually happened, and it's really kind of shocking. It was really kind of shocking to me that they had this parade, and still do. And so that is something, yeah, that was really so another couple of moments that were kind of skin prickling moments when I was in Latvia was the synagogue. There were 65 synagogues in Latvia, in Riga, just Riga alone. and they were all burned on July 4th, except for one that's still standing. And it's the only reason it's still standing was because it is in between two other important buildings, and they were afraid the other buildings would catch fire. So they didn't set fire to it, but they used it to store like horses' hay and stuff like that in it during the war. It's since I was in there, they've renovated it, brought it back, and it's a beautiful synagogue. Um, but anyway, the synagogue where Max is unfortunately murdered, when I went to Latvia and saw in Riga and saw it, I realized it was the one that both Yosel and Max would have attended. It was that close to where their homes were. And I had no idea. I mean, I had 65 to choose from, and I chose that one. And it was the one that they would have attended. So that was just one of those moments where you just kind of know that this, has to be written. It's just one of those things. Um, so that moment and standing in front of their houses, and then going to Rambula, the forest. I went with a guide. It's outside of the city, and it's really like a contrast because it's a beautiful forest, and yet it has all these mounds that of where the bodies are, these long rectangular mounds, and they have like a cement border around them to protect them, and they have stones and things, and they have like a monument in that all now since 1991. But just seeing these mounds and knowing that I found out 26 people with my DNA underneath those was just one of those moments where it was just heartrending. And really just one of those moments where you just know, okay, yeah, no matter how many rejections I get, whatever I have to do, I'm working on this book and I'm getting this book done because nobody knows about this. And it's really horrific what happened. And then in another sort of strange turn of events, I told you about my cousin who went and knocked on her grandmother's door. I gave the name Talon because there were so many Talons. When I went to the Wall of Names in Riga, in the they in the ghetto, the actual ghetto, which looks exactly the same as it did in the war. They have like a living, like an outdoor museum, and they have a wall of names of all of the Jews who were killed. There were hundreds of Talons, hundreds and hundreds of Talons. It was obviously a common name, hundreds of them. And I looked everywhere and couldn't find any that in my family that lived. And so except there's another whole book is my Uncle Monia in Australia. That's another whole book of Talons. They're kind of off the wall, but apart from them, couldn't find any. So the book is about to get published, and I get an email from this guy through Jewish Gen, which is a genealogy site. His name is Steve Talon, and it turns out that his grandfather and my great grandfather were exiled together in 1905 from Riga. And he is my age, but my mother's generation, because he was an oops baby. And so that's why it's his grandfather and my great grandfather. And his great grandfather, because he was a little bit younger, managed in 1908 to escape Siberia. And legend has it that he and another guy got to some water and got a boat, and then the boat leaked and they managed to get in. They were swimming, and then they were in international waters. They got picked up in international waters and ended up in New York, and he settled in the Bronx, New York. And so where Steve Talon still lives. So this was absolutely, I couldn't even believe it. I mean, it was just shocking to me. And the reason that he knew this was I had posted a picture of my great great grandfather, Patel, and he said, "That's my great great grandfather." And so, we literally had the same. I had pictures of his grandfather, Jacob Talon. My grandmother had photos of Jacob Talon, his grandfather. We had so many photos in common in our possession. And I mean, it was just, he looks like my grandmother's brother. It's absolutely like remarkable. And it turns out I had 9 other relatives in New York City, all related to this same great great grandfather. So we actually, when I went to New York to launch the book, wasn't really a launch because of COVID. I just signed it in Barnes and Nobles and stuff. We had dinner, all of us, the 9 of us. And it was amazing because we all come from this one guy. And there were similarities. I could see similarities in my grandmother, my aunt, my mother, in some of them. And it was like, it was unbelievable because I didn't know they existed. And so that is something where the internet and all of that has been absolutely wonderful in this search. But finding them was just a treasure. And Steve Talon and I are actually really close. I actually spent the weekend in the Berkshires with him. And we've just, we're exactly the same age, so that's very cool, to have a cousin exactly the same age. I never did have any. And so and there he is. So it really was kind of an amazing way to finish off the launch of this book, was finding these Talon relatives, who are also excited because this was their story too. They all know they came from Latvia, like they all know that, but they didn't know anything about Latvia. They didn't know anything about this. So because nobody would talk about it. So that's what's so interesting. And so anyway, so that was kind of an amazing experience, and one I really treasure, these relationships. And so we're going to be doing a Zoom talk again soon, and I'm going to connect my mom with them. My mom is in her 80s and can't travel, so that will have to be the way we do it. But it was amazing. And so that's sort of how, kind of a rambling, but sort of how the personal crossed with the book, and how it pushed me, because I did get rejections, and because my agent, when I first submitted it to her, said, okay, I had Miriam in first person, and she said, I want you to put her into third person. Huge job. It's a huge job changing that, but she was right. It worked a lot better. But I wasn't going to give up. I was going to do whatever it took to get this story told, because I think it is so important that we keep adding to the narrative, the Holocaust narrative, and that people who aren't familiar learn from it, and that we don't repeat the past. However, as you probably know from my book, when the Soviets invade Latvia in the beginning of the book, it reads identically to when the Russians invaded the Ukraine, a few months ago. And so it's horrifyingly repeating itself in so many ways, which has been just awful, awful to watch, history repeating itself. So, yeah, so that's.
Well, that's wonderful. So, well, thank you for all that background information. It really is, it is really fascinating to hear your whole family story and how you've managed to weave it in, and some of the surprises you found from writing it. And like I said at the very beginning, I knew now I've got a history degree, and did part World War and in European history, but certainly never knew anything about Latvia. So it's fabulous that you've written it, and I think a lot of people have learned an awful lot about Latvia's story, and what went on in Latvia during the time. So again, thank you very much for writing it. It's wonderful. So I guess we'll move on to a few questions. I've got them all out here. So we got 3 questions came in, all to do with spiderwort. So Miriam's mother's attachment to spiderwort was so poignant, it felt like it was real. So did you base this incident on anything that really happened?
Yes, my Aunt Nusha, as I said, I spent a lot of time with her growing up. She did water her plants with tea, and she was really, really good with plants. I don't remember that the spiderwort, the wandering Jew in particular, but it there's a very good chance she had it. But I know about it. I just know about it, and I thought it just really suited the story, because it does reroot, and this story is about roots and being uprooted, and wandering, which is and having to reroot and all of this. So to me, it was an intentional thing, but it also did come back to my Aunt Nusha, who did water her plants with tea and use the tea bags like 10 times and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, that's how it kind of, I thought, what plant? And the wandering Jew just came. It was there.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely, absolutely fabulous. And again, for those that didn't pick up in the book, The Wandering Jew is called The Wandering Jew because it's an allusion, I think, and you said in your book, to Moses and the Israelites wandering the desert for over 40 years. So
Mm,
very,
mm.
again, I found that all very, very fascinating. So I'm going to ask you, do you have a green thumb? Do you have
I
a
have.
house full of plants? Because I know you said your grandmother, in the story, your grandmother used to say a house is not a home without greenery.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if,
Well, my mother is a greener thumb than me. I do have a wandering Jew or a spiderwort. I do have it and I do reroot it. It's very special to me. I've had one forever. I've always had one. I think, I don't know, that just, it's just one of those things I've always had. I love gardening and garden outside. I love having plants. I do always like to have plants, and do have a number in my house. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So wonderful, wonderful. And again, what Sarah said in the story, she felt rooted in the past, but didn't know enough to carry the traditions that had shaped her mother and Miriam. And I just thought that I felt that was a very, almost a very personal message you were kind of
It
saying.
was,
Yeah.
it was, and it is still something that's really hard, especially like I belong to a synagogue. I reclaim my faith. My Aunt Gail did as well. My brother married a Jewish girl. My niece and nephew are Jewish. We have a lot of Judaism, but we don't have, like, when I go to my synagogue and people talk about their pieces that they inherited from, grandmother, great grandmother, that are, Shabbat candles, stories about their, Jewish past and Passovers and relatives and all of that. I'm sure there were, because we know for a fact that they were celebrating their Judaism all the way through Shanghai. I know that for a fact. We found documentation in newspapers there that they were very involved in the Jewish community. And I don't have anything. I don't have any stories. Judaism is a very stories oriented religion, and so it is really hard at times knowing what we lost. That's really hard for me. It's very hard. I feel sometimes like an outsider, and that's really hard. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Now, getting into some specifics,
Hmm.
one question that came in is why didn't Miriam make more of a fuss when she saw Manya on the street with his wealthy adopted mother? She just says it's not him and walked away. How could she do that? So, where in your mind, and your like, what were you
Yeah.
trying to do with that?
Well, I mean, I read a lot of Jewish literature and a lot of survivor stories, and I knew, and I knew what the displacement camps were like, and they were in a displacement camp, but they were in, they were survivors, and they have nothing when the war is over. They're still Jewish at the end of the day. The Soviets, she knew deep down, and this was true, the Stalin continued to, like, kill, murder Jews, Jewish doctors, the Jewish writers were all killed by Stalin in after the war. So she knew she was Jewish. She had no money. She had no home, no job, no way of feeding a child. And she sees her son, who's lived longer with this woman than with her. And she sees how happy and healthy he is, and he's well dressed, and she knows he's going to be fed, clothed, and loved. She can't do that for him. And I think it's one of those moments as a mother. My editor called it a Sophie's choice moment, where as a mother, and mothers did have to make this decision. This happened. They gave their children away to Catholic families, to orphanages, to nuns, to all kinds, convents, all kinds of things. And I struggled with this because she loved her child, but in the end I thought, how do you tear your child away from that, when they have so much, and you're going back to a little room that you share with your daughter in someone else's house, and you don't know where your future is going to involve. And she just couldn't do it. So it is a heart-wrenching decision.
Absolutely. Now, another question that came in, and it's again about Monya, her son,
Hmm.
and how did he go from being in such a wealthy family to where Sarah found him when she went to visit? Like,
Well,
what? I mean, I don't. That may be a whole other storyline in there, but there
yeah.
wasn't a lot.
Well, I mean, they were wealthy in Miriam's eyes. They probably weren't as wealthy, like, probably an old fur coat, that these kinds of things, but they were not Jewish. and they didn't suffer in the same way as Jews. So they had money, a job, and all of that. But basically, the Soviet system crushed its civilians over time. And so, years later in the 70s, things had gotten worse. I mean, it just for everybody, because they continued to work away at the bourgeois. They continued to make it difficult for people to get food, to get clothing, to get my friend who traveled there, who I talked to at length, she's in my synagogue, also named Shelley, went there in the 70s. Her aunt took her and her cousins to see other cousins in the Soviet Union, and they went by in tourist. So it was phenomenal to talk to her about it, told me about the plane ride, everything. And she said they literally took their jeans and gave them to the family, their cousins, because they could get so much money in the black market for jeans, and things like that. They just had nothing, and like nothing. And so it just would have gotten worse. Like if you had money at the end of the war, it wasn't going to last, unless you worked for Stalin or were one of his sycophants. It just wasn't going to last. You weren't going to have a lot. They wanted to cut that out. They wanted to get rid of intellectuals, anybody like that.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Super. And going back to a part two of this other question, one of the other questions was, this reader said she had a difficult time reading this book. She had to sleep with the light on at night. It filled her with terror. And she wondered about you, the author. How did it affect you when you were writing this book, for the many months that you spent writing it and doing all the research? She felt the details were gruesome and heartbreaking. And it was based on your family, in particular, your great grandfather's brother and his family, and how they were murdered in the Rumbala forest. Were you feeling very depressed? I mean, you said at the beginning you suffer from depression. Like, how hard was it to you actually to write this novel?
That's a really good question. And it was really hard. I actually got stomach aches and massive headaches and would have to go lie down writing scenes and spend a couple of hours lying like with my eyes closed, complete, like it was a long time to write certain scenes, and it was really hard to write. um there's no question it was painful. I thought of Yosel, especially because I have so many pictures of my grandmother standing beside Yosel, and just knowing that they were connected and knowing what he went through. But that's what pushed me to keep going. And I'm not the writer. It's the same when I did my YA trilogy, which is actually read more by women and adults than students, because it is pretty, I would say, graphic. But I don't want to sugarcoat history. I think as a journalist, that's my background. It's historical fiction, but if I'm going to tell you the story, I'm going to tell you the story the way it was. I'm not going to romanticize it in any way, or lighten it, I mean, too much. And believe it or not, there were many things I did not put in that were worse than are in the book, like things that were way worse, and I didn't put them in. And so, so I didn't take the extreme. I didn't even take the extreme. There were, yeah, but it was really, like, I had so many stomach aches. I can't even tell you. Like, it was so hard to write, and I was mentally and emotionally exhausted, and it absolutely affected my depression. There's no question about it. No, absolutely, no question. Especially when I was editing it during COVID, because this was all signed and everything during COVID, and I worked with my editor, and during COVID in a lockdown was editing this, so it was really hard to do that. There's no question.
Well, this lady who submitted the question, Carolyn, she wants to thank you for being able to put these most difficult truths down on paper. And she is so sorry that some of these things happened to your own ancestors. It must have left incredible scars. So anyway, that's just one of the readers here tonight. And I think we're all on the same page as what Carolyn is saying. So thank you on that. Yeah. Next one, another question that came in was, one of the most touching parts of the book was when the farmer apologized to Miriam and she starts to cry. She says, "You've made me feel human." Given all that Miriam has gone through, both before and after this interaction, why was this moment important to include in the story?
Because he saw her. He actually looked at her as a person, I think. And there were many farmers. He represented a lot of farmers who kept people alive. In fact, as you may have read, Miriam was based on Frida Mickelson, who testified in the Nuremberg actually, and she survived living in barns and haystacks and with the help of farmers giving her food. And they looked at these Jewish people like Miriam, like people, not like Jews, not like people that they were people that deserved to eat, that deserved to live. And he saw her and wanted to do more than he could, and she understood that. But to just say sorry to someone, is those two words are, I think, really powerful. It means so much when someone apologizes, especially to someone, like an immigrant who's being treated horribly, or if some one person takes them aside and says, I'm sorry. These are the things that I think can really make a difference. And so she felt like she was seen and that she mattered. And that's what it means to be human.
And it probably gave her the will to go on as well.
Absolutely.
Being seen. So
yeah.
alrighty. Another question that came in is Sarah's mother's superstition. So, and I guess on page 303, it says, if you look back when you say goodbye, you will never see that person again. So that, I know when I read it, gave me goosebumps. And it's just like the number of times I've said goodbye to people, and I've sort of looked back and done that final wave. And I read this and I thought, wow, that's very, very powerful. So do you feel the same way, or did someone in your family feel that? Like
my mother has all these superstitions, and that she got from her mother. And in my research in Ashkenazi Judaism, there are so many superstitions amongst Jews. So my mother has said that to me. My mother truly believes if you break a mirror, you have 7 years of bad luck. My mother, like, it's just like all these superstitions, and so I uncovered all of these superstitions that Jews have, and things they try to avoid, and to get good luck, or to live in prosperity, or to be safe, and all of this. So it is part of the Ashkenazi Jewish culture. Yeah. And she inherited that. Again, that's sort of what we inherit. She inherited all that from her mother. And I say to people, my mother was raised by a Russian Jew, my grandmother was raised by a Russian Jew. Like, this is how it just all is steeped in history and culture.
And how are you with superstitions? I know you say it's being passed down. And how about, you sort of with your daughters? How was that like?
Yes, I do have them. I'm probably not as vocal, but things, yeah, like, I mean, the goodbye, absolutely. I really that. And the mirror, I try not to. I've broken mirrors, so you try not, like, that's a horrible one. 7 years of bad luck. Oh my goodness. But I wasn't as vocal, I think, with my daughters. But they tell me that I did air superstitions, and I do have them. Like, you're not as conscious of them as you think you might be, but I definitely, have my superstitions, or my kind of things, like, that just pervade my being. They're just there. Yeah, definitely.
Good. But thank you. Another question that came in is, why did you choose, and you sort of slightly touched on it a little bit already, but why did you choose to set the 1976 part of the story in Chicago?
I grew up there.
Yeah.
I was there in the 70s. And I didn't you people might think that Canada and the US are similar, but they're not. I can tell you from having lived there, and from talking to my husband, and from talking to people who grew up here. And we came back every year. We went to Montreal to visit. All my family was in Montreal. And I noticed things that were different even then. And and so, for example, we had to do drop and roll during the Cold War in my classroom, like, grade 2, 3, 4, 5, all those grades. We had to practice in case of a nuclear bomb. On the news, the Cold War and the threat of a nuclear war was so intense that I went to bed at night, often thinking I wasn't going to wake up in the morning, that we'd have a nuclear attack. And no one that I've talked to in my circle here ever felt that intensity as I felt. It was just such a pervasive part of my childhood, the Cold War, and the threat. And so that was just there. And I thought, well, that's the most authentic I can write. I can't write 70s Canada. I was only here for a few weeks at a time. I was much more Americanized, and still am, and still have certain things about me that are more American because I'm there. I have a lot of family there still. My brother is there still. My aunt's there. So, I still do. So it had to be Chicago. That's what I remember.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well,
lived,
it's amazing
yeah.
when you put your personal feel into it. It does feel more authentic. So
Well, yeah, and the town where she lived is based on Rolling Meadows. I grew up in Rolling Meadows, which is a little suburb, and it's not far from the city, but it takes like an hour and a half with traffic to get in. But it was inspired by Rolling Meadows where I grew up, the Crawfords, everything. It was all there, and yeah, so I was
wonderful.
inspired by that. Yeah.
Thank you. Now turning to Miriam's father.
Mhm.
So one question that came in is he continues to pray
Yes.
even when none of their prayers are answered. And when he was asked about that, he said, "Prayers give me hope."
Mhm.
Was it bittersweet for you to put those words in his mouth, knowing how many prayers at the time were unanswered?
Yes, I again that I read so many survivor stories, and you know, I would say half kept their faith and half gave it up. Like, others hid it. We have some people in my synagogue that were Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz, and one of whom only came back to the synagogue after her children were grown. Um, so she believed in it and always had faith, but didn't want her children to be Jewish, even though they were. And that's the level. And so that was hard. Yeah. I mean, that faith was, there was a really strong faith amongst Jews, and they did sing, they did chant going in to the like Frida tells in her memoir about how they did chant the prayers and how the faith kept some people going. But younger people would question it, older people would rely on it, and it was a very conservative Judaism there. And faith would have been very much what they would hold on to. So, but obviously, Miriam struggles with faith, as so many do after going through that. Definitely.
Definitely.
Hmm.
All right, and still sticking with Miriam's father. So another question that came in is Sarah reminds, when this reader was reading it, Sarah reminds this reader of Miriam's father, her persistent good naturedness, and her desire to keep her family together. Did you think of their similarities when you were writing the book, or did that just happen by coincidence that Sarah kind of has?
I guess it just happened, although maybe subconsciously, that may have been. But Sarah is actually inspired by my Aunt Gail, my mom's sister, who was in advertising in the 70s, in New York and then San Francisco. And she was the one, she was a female in a man's world, and trying to break that ceiling, and had a lot of difficulties rising. She eventually became a partner, but had huge sacrifices to her personally. Um, and so Sarah was sort of inspired a little bit by that. But her nature just came to me, Sarah. Like, maybe it was, I wasn't even thinking of it. Her character just came in terms of her personality. Like what she did and all of that was my Aunt Gail, but she's not really my Aunt Gail in personality. That just came. So I don't know. Maybe I was affected by Max. I don't know. I loved Max as a character. I loved him, and never had a grandfather that I knew. So maybe he was the grandfather I wanted. And I guess I should say here too that Sarah is lives it gets a chance to do what I didn't get a chance to do. She got the chance to talk to her grandmother and ask questions, and I never got that chance. And so that was what I wanted to write, was that chance to ask questions of my grandmother, of her grandmother. That was important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Interesting. Now, do you know, have any of the Jewish families that used to live in Latvia returned since Latvia's liberation, or have most of them stayed away? Do you like? But again, this is more a history
Yeah.
question. And,
Yeah.
um,
It's a small Jewish community.
yeah,
I was both in Riga and Daugavpils, where they came from before Riga, and in both communities, it's fledgling. They have one synagogue in Riga, still not more than one, and one in Daugavpils. And remember, there were 65 in Riga before the war. There were Jewish schools. There were all kinds of things. Now they have got a Jewish youth group that's going well there, and they have got like a Jewish community center and a Jewish library and a Jewish museum. But it's a small community. People didn't come back. Jews were not treated well in the Soviet Union as a rule, and no, they didn't come back, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So the community was decimated, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to, I know there was a few questions that came in with regards to with everything that's going on with Russia and the Ukraine, and obviously there's going to be stories written down the road, and you've touched on it. I mean, do you think there was any way this could have been prevented in any way, shape, or form? Like, I mean, the oppression that was the Russians have imposed on the Latvians, but also what they're imposing on their own people within Russia and what they're trying to do in Ukraine. Like, I mean, I'm sure it's been very emotional for you to have this constantly in the news, and you see the devastation.
Oh, I think the thing is the media, the propaganda that is what led the Jews in Latvia and the Latvians to become so unaware of what was happening. And again, the propaganda, the lack of a democracy, like any democracy, the one thing a democracy needs is free press. It needs the ability to have free speech without consequences. And so in the Soviet Union, um, Stalin, he killed all kinds of journalists, and he banned them. He exiled, Trotsky. He exiled all kinds of famous writers, and they couldn't speak freely. And the same thing is going with Putin. He has gotten rid of, I think, 40 different newspapers and magazines in the last week alone. The reporters and journalists are actually going to Latvia. They're traveling to Latvia, where they're working out of for safety reasons.
And there's a great article in the Globe and Mail that was in Monday's paper, and I read it, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. Don't hear about Latvia at all, and then it's popping up in the news. So
I know, I saw the same article, and it was shocking me. But they're in Latvia. They've gone to Latvia, but it's that lack of free press. The people in Russia, I have a few friends that have Russian parents, and these people truly believe that they are liberating the Ukraine. They do not know any better. They don't get the media that you and I get. They don't, and it has been so many years of this. They love Putin. They truly believe that they are liberating Ukraine, and that is because of the fake news, the propaganda, all of that. If we could we could break down that wall of falsehoods, I think it would be a major chain, like a major thing. But I mean, it's the same thing in North Korea. It's the same thing in China. If you don't have a democratic society, you don't have free press, you don't have the truth. So these people, they don't know, these soldiers, these Russian soldiers are fighting for something that is completely wrong, and they don't know it. And most of them don't know it.
Yeah, it's really scary how history is repeating itself. And
but again, it's the propaganda. It's the absolute propaganda. In my first 3 books, the first book is Ignited in 1903. There was a pogrom, which is an attack against Jews, because a Russian boy was found killed, and the media said a Jew had killed him to use his blood to make matzah, which is a myth that has been pervasive for centuries. The people believed it, and on the Easter weekend, the entire community had a massive attack against the Jews and destroyed the entire Jewish community based on headlines, false headlines that the editor had put in the newspaper. And in Moldova, which is in Chisinau, Moldova. And that's what perpetuated. It's the false headlines, the false news are responsible for so much hatred and violence. And it just keeps happening over and over again.
So is there anything that we can learn from this, from your family's experience in writing this novel? Is there anything that we can do that you think in our communities here to
I think
change things or to help change? I mean, I know there's been a lot of rallying to try and support the, the Ukrainian families and the refugees and everything else. But is there something in particular, knowing what your family's experience, that you think would really, really help?
Well, I think we really need to support our newspapers. They're not perfect. And I say this having written for the Toronto Star and the National Post, but there's copy editing, there's fact checking. There are things done on a level that is not done on Twitter reports and Facebook things that are coming out and all of this false news. And it's really horrifying to me as a former journalist. I mean, literally my sources would be blindly contacted. Did you say this? Is this accurate statement? All of this sort of thing, I didn't mind because I want it to be honest and accurate, everything you're doing. And I think there's so many papers that have gone under, so much media that has gone under, and they're struggling. And I feel really strongly that we need to keep our media going, on a national level, and we need reporters out there,
Yeah.
that are qualified reporters who can write a fairly accurate. I mean, there's always going to be a little bias, you can't get away from it, but they're edited, fact checked. All of this is done for accuracy. I think we really need to support the media, because we're losing them. And I foresee a really horrible future ahead if we lose Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, all of these papers, and our world becomes one of people sending news through Facebook and Twitter. And that's very scary to me.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's yeah, it's good to hear. It is important, and like you said, good journalism is very special. So,
Mhm.
anyway, we're coming to a close, so we really haven't had a chance to open it up to the floor. I'm just going to conclude with one thing. Before I moved to the house I'm in now, I had neighbors across the street, Peter and Iwa Petrovic, and they were from Latvia, and they never ever wanted to talk about it. I tried to find out a little bit of information, and again, but they didn't want to tell their story to me. They were the most amazing couple. They have both gone to further back wherever they've gone, so, to heaven. And I just wanted to say this novel really touched a chord with me as well, because it was a story that was sitting on my doorstep,
Mm.
and I didn't really explore it any further. It was just like, oh, they're from Latvia.
Yeah.
And so I just want to say we are beyond thrilled that you've written this story. I know it was a tough one for you to write, but I think the more people that get a chance to read it, it's an eye-opening read. And, thank you for putting yourself through all the heartache, to bring this book to readers and to the world. So, thank you again for your time this evening. It's been absolutely fabulous. And I think Cynthia is going to open up the chat so everybody can say their thank yous and everything else. And I'm also going to pass it over to Maya, who is also going to say a couple of words at the end. But Shelley, thank you so very, very, very much.
Thank you for having me and your interest in this book. It honestly means the world to me to be read. That's why I write, to be read. So it's just really wonderful. Thank you.
Shelley, I just want to say that what we've found in Islington Reads is that the right book comes to us always at the right time. And as I was reading your book, my husband serves as a voluntary chaplain in the reserves here in Toronto, but his best friend was serving with the Special Forces in Latvia and has returned home since we finished, just before we finished reading your book. So I was holding that space of how a story opens for us the world, the suffering, and the connection to people's history, but also to our present. And I just really want to bless you into continuing to write, and to know that there's a community of Christians that have a hard story, that have been part of harming, and our interpretation of scripture has not been an easy part of this story that has led to atrocity. So we hold that as Christians in this community in Etobicoke, in interfaith relationships, and in the ways that we mine our scripture for the wisdom that connects us to each other. So I want to hold that for all of us tonight, knowing that we don't hold that lightly as we hold your story tenderly. So really want to bless you into continuing to write your truth, and to know that you're allowing others in our community to explore their own histories and the way that religion and faith and culture bring us to today and into the world we're building together. So I want to say deep thanks. I look forward to the conversations that will all be happening after people listen to you today. And your book will be on my list. I'm doing some summer reads in church on Sunday about books that have been transformative. So I want you to know we'll be lifting that up. So inviting more people to read it in the weeks and months ahead. So it's our privilege just to bless you into your work and say thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's very meaningful. Thank you. I do appreciate it. And I appreciate it. You putting it in your summer reads so more people can know about it. That means the world to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley.
So our next book is Such Big Dreams by Rima Patel. She is actually a lawyer who works for the city of Toronto, and she has written this fantastic book about a young girl who is living in the slums of India and her perseverance to make things right. So it's an absolutely fabulous story. It is going to be on Tuesday, September the 20th at 7 p.m. So got lots of copies in the store. And like I said, it is a fabulous, a very thought-provoking read as well. So hope everybody can attend come September. But until then, hopefully everyone enjoys the summer and does lots of reading, and we'll go from there. And again, Shelley, thank you so much.
Thank you. And your messages are wonderful. Thank you. I've just been reading your messages and they're absolutely wonderful. They're wonderful. Thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate them. So thank you so much for having me and your wonderful, thoughtful questions. Thank you, everybody.